Hello. In this episode of AS for Architecture, I spoke with Álvaro Sevilla-Buitrago, Associate Professor of Urban Planning at the School of Architecture, Universidad Politécnica de Madrid, or ETSAM, about his book Against the Commons, A Radical History of Urban Planning, published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2022. A provocative title, the book presents a history of the ways planning has been developed and deployed to undermine commons, those spaces of mutuality, solidarity, and shared resources, endeavour, and knowledge, and around which our cities and towns have grown. We discuss how commons are co-opted and erased by processes of urban development, but also how new associations and networks of community, civil society, and policymakers are indicating how another way might be possible.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of A is for Architecture. I'm talking today to Dr. Álvaro Sevilla-Buitrago. I think that's pretty good. Spanish is not my first language, so Álvaro, we're going to be talking about your terrific book, Against the Commons, A Radical History of Urban Planning, which you published with Minnesota University Press very recently. Before we get into that, 2022.
Yes, late 2022. Yeah,
late 2022. So it's not too out of time. You haven't forgotten it all already. But before we get into that, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Yes, of course. So first of all, thanks, Ambrose, for the invitation and the interest in the book. In terms of the presentation, well, I'm an associate professor of planning and urban theory at SAM. It's the School of Architecture at the Politécnica de Madrid, the Polytechnic University in Madrid. My research lies at the intersection of urban theory, critical geography, planning history. I'd say I'm tremendously lucky to have the opportunity to combine these different perspectives in my work. It is sort of amusing that whenever I meet new colleagues in some of these disciplines, they tend to think that I come from a different field. When I'm with architects, they think I'm a geographer. When I'm with geographers, they see me as a historian or a designer. So it's interesting. Actually, I was initially trained as an architect. But I soon developed an interest in the social and political dimensions of the built environment. And I realized that cities and space more generally are realities that allow us to grasp, to deal with these issues more openly and profoundly than buildings. So I began reading some of the classics in the field of critical urban studies, work by people like Henri Lefebvre, David Harvey, Neil Smith, Saskia Sassen. And I gradually became a planner and an urbanist, you might say. I actually worked as a planner for about a decade or so. It was, let's say, a very interesting period of my career, during which I learned firsthand many of the problems and contradictions of the discipline. It was sort of a turbulent time in Spain and in Madrid at the time. We had this huge housing bubble. Urbanization was wild, and then of course crisis hit, coincided with the Great Recession in 2007, 2008. And I should add that during this period I was close to and learned a great deal from local social movements that were resisting these processes, movements that would later explode in a wave of civil unrest and discontent in 2011. You may be familiar with the rise of the indignados, the square occupations and encampments in many parts of Spain, particularly in Madrid, that were influential in the subsequent spread of the Occupy movement. So in this context, and as a practitioner, I could experience, as I said, firsthand, the conflicts that plague planning practice. The limitations, the compromises, sometimes also the indifference or blindness of planning structures and planning procedures. towards certain problems. And well, anyway, I combined this professional work with my early steps as a scholar. And at some point, about 12 or 13 years ago, I left planning practice completely, and I became, fully immersed in academic life. And since then, my research has focused on how, urbanization, spatial techniques, design techniques, how planning policies, how they shape social change, right? And an important part of my research has focused on the history of spatial struggles around the commons, uh, which is actually the central topic of this book of Against the Commons. So in hindsight, I would say it is clear how, this formative period has influenced my subsequent work as an academic, and particularly the book.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's a wonderful introduction. Really, very fascinating. You mentioned this idea of the commons, and as you say, it's the subject of the book. And the book reads, perhaps, when I first read it, I thought, oh my goodness, someone's writing against the commons.
Mm.
Like they're a bad thing and we
Yeah,
should get rid of them.
yeah.
Before we get, I guess, get into that,
Mm.
it would be good to kind of understand, I suppose, a little bit about this idea of the commons. Like what are they, or what are they not? In, I suppose, the public imagination, if there is one around the commons in Britain, it's around the idea of this central piece of land
Yeah.
within medieval
Yeah.
urban spaces in which the collective, the serfs, I suppose, the peasantry, were allowed to graze their flocks or their stock. Is that it?
Well, in part it is. The notion of the commons has actually developed uh, a much wider scope in recent years. Um, so much that currently we sometimes have to, to try to demarcate, as you say, the concept to make clear what we mean about when we talk about the commons. And just to clarify, of course, the title Against the Commons is a descriptive title, you would say, what
An objective.
planning, yes, an objective title describing what planning has been doing regarding the commons for a few centuries now. So to try to explain or to define the question of the commons, maybe we need a bit of context. I would say that there are three traditions that have dealt with this idea of the commons more closely. And if we go very quickly uh, through them, you can get an impression of how broad the term is right now, how it is being used right now. So in the first place, we would have institutional economists. Most prominently, of course, Elinor Ostrom, the Nobel Prize, and her collaborators, who focused on commons as who defined commons as shared natural resources, common property under different forms of collective management. These resources were common in the sense that they are neither private nor public, but collectively owned and organized. And this particular tradition showed how these resources are essential for the sustenance of the communities who manage them, right? So second, we will have historians, social historians, especially British historians that explored the type of commons that you were talking about, and not only urban commons, but actually uh, more often rural commons, common land, the institution of common land and common rights, and they analyze this institution, exploring the social, not only the material or economic aspects of the commons, which was the part that institutional economists have emphasized, but it also how the social, cultural, and political dimensions attached to these resources, describing the commons not only as goods but also as as basis of autonomous forms of social organization. And third, I would say that there's another very important tradition, which is recent critical political theory that has expanded the concept beyond these previous understandings, seeing the commons not as something from the past, but actually as a sort of blueprint for a future society, for a future post-capitalist society. So here, commons are framed broadly as forms of collectively produced wealth. So this includes ideas, language, social networks, things like that. So in this perspective, the commons is framed as a project, as a vehicle to expand democracy. Now, in the book, I define the commons as shared, self-managed resources and spaces that are essential for the reproduction of communities independently from direct market influence and state control. And this would also include, cooperative practices, institutions, territorialities, spatial practices that help sustain these resources and places. And I would stress three ideas here. First, the idea of autonomy, of independence and autonomy. Commons are spaces of autonomy. They provide opportunities for the self-reproduction and self-management of these communities that allow them to avoid complete dependence on markets, on state support, on wages, and so on. And this explains why in certain contexts, commons becomes problematic. They become an obstacle, especially under capitalism. This would require a bit of sociology or sociological history. But to be brief, capitalism is a system that requires it's a very unstable system. So one of the things that it requires is to keep some sort of social order, social balance. It requires securing the reproduction of this critical part of the population, the working population, as subaltern classes. Subaltern meaning that these populations will reproduce within the framework of the system. That they reproduce within the framework of the system means that they labor, that they live, they consume, they socialize, they have children within the confines of this framework. Now, the problem is that commons allow, in various ways, allow these communities to escape this framework and these forms of compulsion. In the common, you may get food, fuel, other informal incomes for free, so you don't rely entirely on wages. You may participate in forms of sociality that challenge the dominant social order or promote political antagonism. This is why we should keep in mind the commons are about self-reproduction and autonomy. This is why at some point they can become an obstacle and problematic for particular social projects or hegemonic projects, right? The second aspect that I would emphasize is space, of course. Space is a very important issue when we talk about commons. Space, actually, I would say a fundamental feature of commoning. Commoning understood as the practice of building commons or producing commons. Commoning is often territorial. It is a form of collective appropriation of places, appropriation and production of places that results from the need that communities have to use space as a source of power. And one of the most, I would say, fascinating and enjoyable parts of the research for the book was actually to find and to reconstruct these dynamics of appropriation, which in some cases could be seen as forms of planning from below. Anyway, space is often central to the commons, and this is why attempts to eradicate them sometimes resort to spatial procedures, and this is why planning becomes entangled in these struggles. And finally, the third aspect of the commons that I would emphasize, which this also allows us to differentiate what is a commons and what is not a commons, is the third aspect I would say is solidarity and a certain drive to openness. Commons often, not always in history, but they often incorporate these forms of solidarity and potentially also openness based on, the central role of cooperation in the production of commons and the fact that commoners are usually vulnerable populations, as I said. So you expect to find, elements of mutual support, reciprocity, hospitality, which often blur the boundaries of the community. This is not always the case, I should say. And of the three aspects that I mentioned, this is perhaps the more complicated. Especially when we are talking about material resources, you can find more restrictive approaches, right? But you wouldn't say that a commons is exclusive. For instance, you wouldn't say that a gated community or a luxury condo is a commons, right? In the same way, you wouldn't say that a street or a cafe or a square or a park is in itself a commons. As I said before, a particular space requires a community of action that is building, giving sense or meaning to these spaces to turn them into places and to turn them into a basis or a platform for commoning. No?
I see. At its heart, I suppose, the notion of a commons problematizes the present. It problematizes the capitalistic paradigm. And as you said in your discussion of your own background, 2007, 2008, and the economic crash, and all the way through to 2000 and well, to the current period, really, it hasn't really stopped. We've got this kind of crisis of capitalism.
Yeah.
In your reading of this, and I suppose this is a fairly Marxist reading, if I'm correct in associating this idea of commons around Karl Marx's discussions around the commons in Capital. There's this idea that the capitalistic mode of reproduction is deficient in terms of human flourishing. Or
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I suppose the counterpoint to that would be to say that, would be to ask, what are the metrics that are used to define that problem? How are we supposed to, given that, we live longer, healthier, more leisured lives?
Yeah.
I mean, and I suppose I'm asking this question from the perspective of specifically the urban experience, not the individual, but the experience of the urbs itself.
Well, let's see how I put this. One point would be to say to see how in history the system produces this cyclical crisis of reproduction. When we talk about crisis of reproduction, we mean moments in time in which large sectors of the population find it increasingly difficult to survive or to live decently, let's say, depending on how you define decency at different historical moments, which of course changes. But what we see is that, as I said, capitalism has this internal dynamic of perpetual growth that inevitably leads to intermittent crisis. Capitalism has to grow. If it doesn't grow, it it becomes problematic and it generates crisis. If it grows too much, it also generates crisis of overproduction or underconsumption. So it's crisis is intrinsic to the history of this system. And crisis of reproduction is for us who are working in the field of urban studies or architecture. I would say crisis of reproduction are one of the symptoms which we can deal with or we can use more clearly to identify this inner laws of motion of the system. Now, in terms of the city and urbanization, urbanization is of course, it's not something specific to capitalism, but capitalism, just as if we were talking, for instance, about markets, markets are not specific to capitalism, but there's a particularity of capitalist markets or capitalist urbanization. When capitalism spreads, it tends to capture these pre-existing institutions or processes or dynamics and transforms them. In the realm of space or geography or the production of space or urbanization, this is very clear. We should mention here, for of course, the work of David Harvey, who was, or Henri Lefebvre, who were some of the first authors to emphasize this aspect that capitalism produces its own space and is constantly forced to restructure space in these subsequent cycles of economic growth and subsequent crisis. And in order to overcome this crisis, capitalism sometimes has to look for new spatial fixes that allow it to enter a new phase, a new stage, and in which the economy is somehow healed and moves forward. The point for me in this book was to see how the history of planning, the evolution of planning techniques, of planning as an institution is somehow entangled in these processes, right? And how urbanization and planning become involved in these problematics, and more particularly in relation to struggles over the commons. As I said, the commons are this spaces of possibility and autonomy that allow, especially poor communities, a sort of breathing space outside the compulsion and coercion and pressures of everyday life under capitalism. And sometimes this autonomy or this independence, it's quite broad. And they become problematic, and this is why we see this the unfolding of these struggles over the commons, the struggles to destroy, to to repress, to eliminate, to contain the commons. The approaches may be different. But
are these commons that you're talking about, are they quite similar to Foucault's idea of heterotopias? Is this what we're talking about? Spaces in which kind of discrepant behaviors? Because I guess the question that's coming, that I'm thinking about is this issue around autonomy. How is this sustained? How is an autonomous space like a commons or per a commons you're describing? How is it sustained? How is it gate kept? How is it mediated and curated?
Yeah. The idea of heterotopia in Foucault is, well, it is complex, but we tend to associate it with spaces of marginality and of deviant behaviors in that sense. And I would say maybe today we see the commons as something relatively exceptional or marginal, but in history and across the globe, communal arrangements have been a feature of cultures and society um, uh, since the beginning of time. Since if you go back to the description that institutional economists provide, that they are talking just about community management of collective resources, that
Hmm.
these communities need to survive. So this is something that we can find across the globe in many places, in many different forms. Sometimes they have to do with material resources. Sometimes this is related with more social, cultural aspects. I wouldn't say that commons and heterotopias are the same. Uh, Commons can be a realm of heterotopia. Uh, but in history, for instance, they were there were many periods in which they were actually dominant. And
Okay.
I mean, in quantitatively dominant
Okay.
in terms of population and land use, right? So I wouldn't say that they were marginal at all.
Okay.
Yeah,
I guess I'm just trying to work, sort of thinking about them, because you mentioned at the beginning the Occupy movement, and that very much, although was
yeah,
sort of a mechanism for producing a form of commons
yeah,
within the overarching structure of capitalist space,
yeah, yeah. Yes, yeah.
that they became sort of heterotopias in a way.
Yes, yes, and of course,
And I can think of things that go beyond that. So it's not just protest. Sites of protest very much are both sort of, I suppose, spontaneous commons, temporary commons, and they have led to a form of architectural practice,
yeah,
tactical urbanism and pop-upism and all of these things, which kind of model that behavior, that they're heterotopic, they're temporary, they're kind of critical, they're engaged. And then you've
yeah,
got other things where you've got perhaps longer term things which sort of again build on that identity. Parks or derelict spaces in urban centres where community groups co-opt them for alternative education or
hmm
Tai Chi or whatever it is. So I guess I'm just thinking about it not in the historical sense, but in the sense of the way I
currently,
have experienced them.
yeah, yeah, and in that case, you are absolutely right. And yes, in recent decades, the commons have become more marginal, precisely because there's this long history of dispossession and destruction of the commons. So it's more and more difficult to find this sort of self-managed realms of autonomy that are primarily oriented towards reproduction. Reproduction, again, it can be about providing the community with food and energy
Mm,
or whatever. But in recent times, of course, other aspects, since these material needs are usually covered,
mhm,
at least in the global north, we find that commons become more relevant in terms of, yes, this search for spaces where you can develop cooperative energies,
mhm,
democratic projects, and things like that. If you go, for instance, if you take the examples of the occupations of squares in the last decade, I would say yes, these were spaces for protest. What makes them different from uh, um, a standard or a conventional demonstration is that these people took space, they occupied the space for a long time. For instance, in Madrid, we had the central square in the city occupied for over a month. And in order to do that, in order to develop this kind of territoriality, you need to develop some sort of infrastructure, which requires collective organization, uh, um, uh, 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 in a way, a sense of collective project, in a way, also some sort of collective design, right? And one of the things that I found most illuminating from that period and that experience was actually the ways the indignados, the people who were occupying the square, were organizing the provision of food, the provision of health, immediate basic health care, how they manage the waste that they were producing, and then how they were able to organize in a very short time frame services, collective services such as a library, places where you could get legal assistance and things like that out there on in the tents and in this very precarious form of settlement, but at the same time extremely imaginative, creative, and powerful in a way.
So these commons, I'm just trying to get my head around it. I want to get onto this way that planning has contributed to the loss of the commons.
Yeah.
Have they been historically problematized because they are in some way a sort of mirror to the dominant system and it doesn't really like the image, it doesn't want the image known? Or is it because they occupy space that could be more profitably used within a capitalist system? Or is it some kind of broader idea? And I know that Ostrom talked about sort of Thomas Hobbes's idea of the Leviathan, this idea that left to their own devices, there's this absolute overexploitation of any common resource, and therefore these things have to, in a sense, be utterly controlled because
Yeah, the
essentially,
tragedy of the commons.
yeah, the tragedy of the commons, because essentially
Yeah.
people are bad. So I guess question one, how has planning participated in this? And question two, why?
Yeah, well, how? Well, I would tell you it depends, and actually this relates to the different scenarios that you were tracing. It depends on the historical moment, and actually you were covering several of the situations that we find in the book, and the way planning responds to that also depends from the specific form of commoning it is targeting, from, of course, other contextual aspects related to the form of the state at the time, the balance of social forces at the time, and so on and so forth. Um, we should perhaps first say what is planning, what planning is, which is the book covers a long period of time, over 3 centuries. So in this at this scale, planning is different things in different periods. So I tend to define planning as a sort of fluid set of techniques that mediate processes of urbanization, not only to transform cities or landscapes or places, but more generally to achieve long-term social and economic change. This is, for me, this is the plan in planning, using space to transform social structures. Now, so the book, as I said, explores these shifting sets of techniques, which involve not only town, what we now understand as town and urban planning, but also forms of urban design, forms of architecture, land policies, social policies, landscape design, different manifestations of this broader project. And the book looks for forms of coherence across time, in terms of the strategies and procedures that are trying to, as I said, to mobilize space to guide social change. And one of these directions, or one of these forms of coherence, is this drive towards dispossession, this decollectivization, disempowerment, and so on. So how it works, to simplify a lot, we could say that we have a certain group or a certain population facing difficulties, they need to appropriate space to secure some forms of, as I said, self-subsistence, self-reproduction, autonomy, and they produce a commons. These commons may contradict the dominant social or economic order for different reasons, and at some point they become an obstacle. So in these contexts, among other approaches, we usually find this implementation of strategies to undermine the spatial basis of these commons. So in terms of planning, new planning schemes emerge to target particular, places or spatialities in different ways. They sometimes achieve their goal, and particular forms of commoning are removed, privatized, co-opted, whatever. And this particular mode of commoning may disappear or wane. But this is not the end of the story, because this often generates new crises of reproduction in these populations. And so we see new forms of, of collective appropriation and new social spaces, and the story starts again. So I'm trying to describe like the laws of motion of planning evolution across history in relation to this problem. And in the book, what I do is to identify this dynamic as the subsequent opening of new frontiers of commoning, and subsequently new frontiers of dispossession. So strategies change for both commoners and those who try to dismantle the commons, and so do planning procedures and schemes. This is actually the core historical argument of the book, that planning innovation, the emergence of new planning paradigms, is intimately linked to this story of struggles over the commons. Now, how this happens in particular points, well, we could do a chapter by chapter summary. That would take a lot of time, but to be brief and to give some examples, this can be in the form of the attempt to redefine property structures and property regimes, which is particularly important when we are dealing with the institution of common land and common rights. We can find examples in which this has to do with the design of public space and publicity itself as sort of the regime of use of public spaces, of streets, parks, of community centers, and so on. We find it when we see planners trying to define programs to shape collective leisure and leisure facilities. We find it when we see planners doing developing new ideas in relation to land use distribution and the structure of the city, metropolitan structures, and so on and so forth. So these different things become central to planning discourse in particular times, at particular points in history, not because planners suddenly have a brilliant idea and they innovate in their field, but because these approaches become instrumental and critical for these larger strategies of dispossession at particular points in time, right? So in this way, we can build an alternative genealogy of planning, where certain techniques and paradigms and models are not the product of intellectual history or institutional history, which is what planning history usually does, but the outcome of social struggles. And sorry, there was you had a second question, right? Why they do this? Well, this goes back to what I said before. Why this need to remove or contain or privatize or commodify the commons? depending on what period you're talking about, because they hinder the advance of capitalist development of markets, sometimes of elite hegemonies. Why space in this story? Because commons usually have this spatial basis, which is so so critical to understanding both its production and its potential destruction.
I didn't ask this. Thank you for that. I didn't ask this question in the notes I sent to you yesterday. What is the association? Is there an association between commoning, the loss of commons through planning, and gentrification? Is there a connection here?
Yes, of course. As long as you define gentrification as a replacement of communities of usually lower incomes by groups of populations with more affluent populations, you usually have you have the ingredients for this kind of battle that I was referring to. You have communities, poor communities, which usually appropriate their spaces, their neighborhood, their the streets.
Mm-hmm.
To sort of to turn the street and the space itself into a resource that they can use to to complement
Mm-hmm.
their household incomes.
Yeah, yeah.
Sometimes to simply to build networks of solidarity or of collective identity, political subjectivities, and so on and so forth. When these communities are displaced by gentrification, of course, these things uh, are eroded or simply disappear. So, of course, yes, gentrification is a critical vector, I would say, of dispossession and dismantling of commons, especially I would say in the second half of the 20th century, since the mid 20th century.
Yeah. But because this idea of creating spaces of solidarity isn't exclusively the possession of marginalized or poor people. I'm thinking here, for example, of communities of artists, for example, who have got together in urban spaces, created essentially, in a strange kind of way, physical but cognitive commons, and then have seen that taken from them through processes of urban regeneration that has co-opted their. And do we see this a lot, that the actual character of the common becomes, as whatever it is, becomes embedded within the logic of the planning that takes it over as well?
Yeah, well, this is specific to recent decades, I would say. Before the 1960s, 1970s, the type of approach that you would find from planners is more negative. Sometimes, as I said, it's a question of destroying the commons, eliminating common institutions, or containing the social and political energies that these spaces produce. But since the 1960s and 1970s, I would say that we enter a new period in which planning approaches gradually learn to work with the commons, to incorporate this kind of collective energies. And I wouldn't say planning. I would say more generally urban policy and also real estate strategies and corporate strategies. They learn to incorporate those aspects of the commons that can help to to increase land values and so on, while at the same time, of course, repressing these other aspects that are indigestible for the system or the elites, aspects related to the generation of this antagonistic political subjectivities and so on and so forth. Artists, which we should mention, you were differentiated between poor communities and artists, which we should say that sometimes artists are really poor as well, at least when they are young. and they are trying to live as artists, and they have been protagonists in this process of gentrification precisely because they tend to move to these uh, spaces in decline, right? And they, they bring new energies, these capacities to reimagine these places. But I would say, comparing this to the standard, the conventional picture that we have about this process, which we usually focus on in places like New York or London and things like that. This is why I took Milan in the last historical chapter of the book. I took Milan, which has these ingredients where we see, yes, groups of artists, art activists, design activists coming together, but coming together with working class populations in inner city neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And this combination, this blend is extremely interesting because you see how the sort of creative, the emphasis on creative activity that artists bring is quickly incorporated into the identity of these working class communities. So it becomes really, I would say, explicitly a tool within this movements, this grassroots movements. And you see artists cooperating with this with their neighbors to fight against processes of tertiarization, the transformation of residential activities to office activities and commercial activities and so on and so forth. So yes, but and then gradually in the 80s in Milan and more generally, you gradually see how the municipality, and particular, but I wouldn't say the municipality takes it's leading this process. It actually comes from within those creative communities sometimes, that some of them faced with a much a bleaker context in the 80s, where political activism is gradually waning in Italy, in Milan in particular, after a long wave of repression of these radical movements. So some of these artists find themselves increasingly isolated, and they turn this capacities that they have learned and developed together with working class movements and radical movements. They turned those capacities to reimagine space in the face of urban decline. They turned them into in a different direction, and in a way also to promote their own careers. And this becomes the basis for this new forms of urban regeneration, which are increasingly bottom up, increasingly from below, until at some point both the local administration, the municipality, and real estate agents realize that this is actually a very interesting energy that is there, that doesn't require huge investments, and that if properly promoted and fostered, can actually bring about the desired revalorization of places that were declining for a long time at that point, right? And this is when we see this new paradigm of urban regeneration, tactical urbanism, participatory planning emerging, which is it is our current landscape as planners, and for those of us who are doing research in urban studies, this is the current landscapes of our cities, a situation in which Um, the 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 state, uh, real estate, corporations and planners have learned to incorporate, to capture, to co-opt this collective energies, this collective creativity, to reimagine places in decline, and to, to pump them up,
Mhm.
let's say,
But that sounds very
driving
encouraging
values up.
and sort of, this sounds like a turn, a good turn.
Yeah.
I guess to finish briefly, I suppose, on a final question, this is one of the practical steps that city planners have taken
Mm.
to reclaim planning as a tool for the commons. What other steps? And most importantly, coming back to this idea of this strong grassroots energy that now exists within this discourse and in practice on the ground. What can communities be expected to do to kind of
Yeah.
reimagine the commons or maintain the commons?
Mm. I don't know if it's encouraging. It's also frightening, Ambrose, to be
Okay.
frank, because when it's clear that, from the perspective of these communities, when it's clear who is your enemy, it is easier to fight back.
Hmm.
When you have this sort of more ambiguous situation, it's much more difficult. And actually, this has allowed, in some cases, investors and speculators to break, to divide, local movements, because they were, trading, exchanging with them, and negotiating, so that they were able to convince part of these movements to participate somehow in their projects. So yes, it's an interesting situation in any case.
Mm.
This is actually the sort of discourse that people like Michael Hart and Tony Negri were emphasizing a decade ago, a situation in which the system, capitalism, or the elites are no longer able to produce wealth, in the at the rate or in the volume that they were able 50 years ago. So they need to rely on this sort of collective energies to keep the machinery working, right?
Okay. Yeah.
In any case, I would say, what planners or architects can do to help in this regard. Well, I think that first we need to, we need to be aware of how these realities work. We need to be more sensitive towards these collective capacities, um, more aware of the connection, the intimate connection that exists between space and the commons, and how our techniques and our schemes may facilitate or hinder this connection. We should, I think, keep in mind that you don't design a commons. As I said, the engine of commons is always somehow outside design or the field of a designer's work. But we can help create conditions for the commons to thrive, you know, and protect these dynamics of collective appropriation if we are able to identify them. And of course, we should avoid disrupting these dynamics with our interventions, which is what has happened most frequently in the past. So I would say that for planners, I mean, for communities, I wouldn't say that this is, we don't need to give any kind of lessons. At least as a planner or a scholar, I don't feel legitimized to give any kind of lesson to communities. I mean, the book, about a third of the book describes how communities have been able to build their own spaces, to develop their own um, land use systems, their own parks, their own social centers, without the support of architects, planners, and so on. But for planners and architects, I think that yes, we can give them some orientation. So I would say that first, I would say three things. First, I think that we should keep in mind that for commons to happen, we need to leave room for them to happen. We have to provide space for commoning. And most of the times, architects and planners and designers, and of course developers, we are obsessed with filling space with content and infrastructure. We are used to see vacant space as wastelands, and I think we should avoid this attitude, right? I think we could think of it as this vacant spaces as fallow spaces that have a lot of potential if you allow collective appropriation to happen, right? So first and most important, I would say that we need to make room for commoning, let it happen. Use our techniques, especially if you are a planner working for a municipality, use the framework, the planning framework, to allow this to happen. Second, and closely connected to this, is that we need to protect the commons. So we can use, instead of thinking of how could I design the commons, instead of that, I think that we should mobilize our knowledge, our technical leverage to protect commons from privatization, from commodification, from gentrification, as you said. For instance, we can use planning, regulation, the coercive force of the state as a sort of shield, a barrier, to contain, to counter, to block the penetration of market actors, in particular communities, in particular neighborhoods, and so on. So I think we should focus on using our instruments or tools to create this sort of infrastructures of protection. And third, of course, sometimes we should intervene if needed. We should intervene in the commons. We should regulate the commons. I think that we should be careful not to romanticize the commons, because sometimes they can become exclusive, and in those cases when these principles I was referring to at the beginning, solidarity, democracy, and so on, if these principles are abandoned, if the commons deviate from these principles, I think that we should intervene to avoid it. If a commons starts looking like a gay community, then yes, we can certainly do something about it. And well, I would say that it's the examples of this sort of alliances, because especially I think that these points I was emphasizing, they basically refer to what one can do as a planner or a designer or an architect working for the state, as a civil servant, for a local administration, public administration. I think that the examples of this potential cooperation between commoners, communities, and municipalities or the state, they are there. In fact, this is informing a whole new approach under the term PCPs, public commons partnerships. You may be familiar with the more famous or infamous PPPs, public-private partnerships, which became a hallmark of neoliberal urban policy. Well, PCPs is a sort of radical alternative to that, fostering this kind of cooperation between the state, communal projects, promoting at the same time the democratization of administrative and planning procedures, but also putting communities and commoning collectives in control of assets, of resources, of spaces, of planning itself, right? And there are plenty of examples out there. for instance, when municipalities cooperate with the cooperative, for instance, with limited equity cooperatives to prevent speculation and gentrification in certain areas. For instance, Amanda Huron has brilliant work on this phenomenon in Washington, D.C., for instance. In Barcelona, for example, the previous government, this has changed, but the previous government developed a very interesting approach trying to establish this as a general framework to support a constellation of cooperative and communal initiatives across the city, some of them related to community gardens, some of them related to self-managed social centers, to try to help to secure their continuity and so on and so forth. So this sort of cooperation with the state always has its problems, but when compared to to business as usual, I think they're huge. They're making this kind of initiatives are making huge progress in that direction we were mentioning.
Fabulous. Well, that's a wonderful point to finish on. Thank you very much, Álvaro. That was really fantastic.
Thank you, and look forward to seeing this kind of developments.
Compare and contrast Garrett Hardin's "Freedom in a common brings ruin to all" with Commons' "It don't take a whole day to recognise sunshine." I'm with the latter. You should probably read Álvaro's book to see how you might be too. Thank you to Álvaro for taking the time to speak with me and for sharing his knowledge so generously, and to University of Minnesota Press for sending me such a lovely edition of the book. Please see the podcast descriptions for links to it and to Álvaro's social and professional profiles, and thanks for listening.